Hello again, SmythOS innovators. We are diving deep into API calls and error handling. In this video, we'll explore the difference between direct API calls and using components, and we learn how to handle errors effectively. Let's join Mike as he guides us through this crucial aspect of SmythOS.
So what I want to try and do is actually call this API, right? And so what I'm going to do here is going to also demonstrate that the calling of an API versus the calling of a component the component simplifies things drastically. It makes them much easier. So what we need to do is get a valid URL for our API call.
Mike's demonstrating how components in SmythOS simplify API interactions. But understanding direct API calls gives you more flexibility and control. Let's watch as he sets up a direct API call.
So let's go ahead and go over to the Search API documentation. Here's this, and we will copy this and then bring it over into our API. Now, for our API key, if you recall, we actually have that API key that's stored somewhere. And so we need to get that key from here. We know that API key works because remember when we did a web search, it actually worked, right? So there's our URL for that API key. We don't have any headers set, and we're not actually setting any content type. We don't have any body yet. Maybe we could do this all with the simple key here. So how do we actually put together this thing? Here's our API endpoint. So we could say and query, that and is the ampersand there, query equals, for example, COVID-19. And so we need to have the API key and the query. So what I want to do is actually also pull in the search type, remember? So let's see, where was that? Search parameters type. Oh, this is actually for the response object, not for this. Okay, so with APIs, there's your request. And you can think of this is essentially the same thing as going to a web page, putting in a URL, and getting back that web page, right? When you do that, you actually then get a response. And in the case of an API, that response tends to be one thing. It's just one thing, but it's a package that has a lot of stuff in it, right? So in this case, what we're looking for is we need to put, we're not going to specify desktop because desktop is the default. We're not going to go ahead and put in a location.
Notice how Mike uses the API documentation to guide his setup. He's showing us how to structure our API requests, including the URL, API key, and query parameters.
We're just going to use my location. We're going to use the Google domain, country. We're not going to put in language. We're going to stick with the default of 10. We're going to stick with page 1. And oh, interesting. So, Elliot, what have you been doing with your email? So what we have here is these are all the things that we can call, and it appears that we can't actually specify that it should actually be for news or for web. So looks like we can actually make this call. Let's go ahead and do that. And what we're going to do is do and query equals, and then we want to go ahead and put in a variable, but we don't have a variable yet. So let's go ahead and save this one. This is a rough equivalent to what we have inside the component, but we need to have an input here. So to add the input, we have to first turn off debug and then add in query. Okay. So in our API call, first of all, this API call is a get, which matches with this this kind here. Then we have the query, and what we want to do is drop in this variable, right? This variable, running this over, matches with this input parameter, okay? This is our API key. This is our variable. We have no headers, nothing fancy here.
Mike's breaking down the anatomy of an API call. He's explaining how different parameters affect our request and how to interpret the response we get back.
Very, very simple API call. Let's go ahead and debug. We're going to run it, and we're going to put we have a problem, missing search type. That's interesting. You did not identify search type. So this is one of the interesting things that you find with documentation. Oftentimes the search type is not necessarily in the documentation for some reason, but we know that it's necessary because it just gave us that error directly from this call, right? Type, there's the error is 410 missing search type. So if we go back over to our API documentation, we look in the API documentation for the search type. They don't have 410, but instead of invalid search type, it's giving us 410 that it didn't have a search type. So it appears that you do have to identify it. So this is clearly a problem with the AVES documentation, where they don't give us the capability of actually using their API based on what you see here. In other words, it's not just the API key and query, because that's exactly what we did here, isn't it? Right? We gave them the query and we gave them the API key, and it still failed. So let's make sure that we catch this here. Let's go ahead and catch this error. To do that, we're going to have to turn off debug, add an output. Who knows what I need to add here? That's right, an underscore error. Let's go ahead and try and run this again. Error here. Yes, I know I'm going to have to change my API key after this. So it's still, we have a missing search type, right? So that's essentially the fact that even though the documentation says that all you need is the query and the API key, that is clearly not enough based on their error code. So so if we go ahead and run this one, right, we're still in debug.
Watch closely as Mike debugs the API call. He's encountering an error and showing us how to interpret and handle it, a crucial skill in working with APIs.
Let's take a look at our log here. Here is our debug log, and what we see is query equals and then type equals, right? So we're pulling this out here. Type equals news. That's what we want to do, is we want to grab type, and we're going to pull that over into our test, right? So we're going to say type, and we're going to start with not news. Let's start with web. Make sure that our API call is working. Okay. So we're going to run this. What is generative AI? We start with web. Hey, look at that. It's working. And we get back our results. And then we are now going to go in and change this. Again, we're going to, so this is one of the nice things. You saw me earlier and I was working directly in the URL. This is a really nice feature within Smyth that allows you to actually edit each one of those without having to worry about, am I getting the ampersand correctly? Am I adding proper encoding? Now what we want to do is we want to change this from web to news. And this is our way of actually working with our component. And we're going to test this again. I can tell you this is going to fail. And it fails. And it fails with that 401, did not provide a valid parameter. Oh my goodness, this is so horrible. What this ultimately means is that that news parameter for the type of search does not work with AVES, and a bug needs to be filed with them.
See how Mike adjusts the parameters and retests the API call? This iterative approach is key to refining your API interactions and understanding how different inputs affect the output.
So we are making a request. It's called a GET. And by the way, when you put a URL inside of your browser, by the way, we can do this as well here. Now that I know I have to change my API key shortly. Here, if I can actually run this directly inside of my web browser, and it will come back with that same error, right? This is a GET call. Is the normal URL that it's just a URL, encoded URL on your web browser, same kind of thing. It's getting that. It's saying, hey, to the server, I need to get this URL specifically breaks down into different parts, right? And those different parts are the domain, in other words, where I'm going to actually do this, the name of the API, in this case, the API call, which is called search, and then these are all the variables that I will need to use in order to make that call. And we know that we need type because remember we got back the error when they had that there to begin with. So this allowed us to be able to go ahead and take what is an existing component and do most of what that component does. But as you can see, it's pretty complex compared to the component. The component just gave this all these good things as the defaults, and they put in the normal defaults from the AVES API, and then allowed us to go ahead and run that. And then within the AVES piece, it also allowed us to choose from the valid list of devices as well as search types. We ended up with an error. This is actually an error inside of AVES, and AVES is not doing what it says it can do in its documentation, and the documentation is clearly flawed. This, unfortunately, is normal. Most of the time for enterprise applications, you're going to get like vast numbers of calls. But with API calls in general, we are making a call, we're getting back a response, and then we're parsing that response. That is why you see this called response. And because we got an error, we did not actually get this response, but instead, because we added the underscore error, we got that here, and we could handle this separately, right? So let's say AVES in the future changes things from calling it web to Google, because maybe they've added not just web, but Google and Perplexity and Bing and other searches, and that's how they do that. So you want to make sure that you keep and catch the errors for API calls. So let's just go ahead and review really quickly what we've done. We've worked with a component, managed the error in a component to actually identify what the error is. We've looked at what this component actually does by taking a look at the log. We've duplicated what it does by using an API call. And then in that API call, we went ahead and used our vault to go ahead and use the API key, then pulled in the query for that API key, as well as added the required parameter of type, made that work when we set it to web, but when we set it to news, it is broken.
Mike's highlighting an important point here. Sometimes API documentation can be a bit flawed. Learning to troubleshoot and handle unexpected errors is a vital skill in API integration. That was a fantastic walkthrough, Mike. We've seen how to set up direct API calls, use API documentation, handle API keys securely, and test our calls with different parameters. We also learned the importance of error handling and how to deal with documentation inconsistencies. Remember, SmythOS enthusiasts, mastering these skills gives you the power to connect your projects to a world of external data and services, even when things don't go as planned. In our next video, we'll explore using Postman for even more advanced API testing. Until then, keep innovating with SmythOS.